Hi, you're listening to An Unruly Life, a podcast for people navigating change, reinvention, and the space between who they were and who they're becoming. I'm Rebecca Peabody, author, cultural historian, and coach. I help thinkers and creatives find clarity, confidence, and new possibilities. Today's episode is a special one. It's the first one, and the first in an ongoing conversation about reimagining the post-PhD career with a special focus on professionalization, careers beyond academia, and entrepreneurship. The format is a little different from what you might expect from a podcast and from the way this podcast will usually sound. I organized a panel conversation at the most recent American Studies Association conference. If you're an academic, you'll know that those kinds of conversations can be amazing, but they're also ephemeral, there for the benefit of the speakers and a select audience, and then gone once the session ends. I wanted to capture this one for a broader audience, so I had it recorded, and I'm really pleased to be able to share it with you here. Even if the format is a bit different, the content is right in line with one of my core missions, which is creating community and an expanded sense of possibility through sharing our stories with each other. And there are some great stories here. We'll dive into the recording just as the panelists are introducing themselves, so I'll give a little background here just to set the scene. First, how I fit into this story. I have a joint PhD in the history of art and African American studies from Yale University, and am currently head of research projects and academic outreach at the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles, California. I've spent 15 years now straddling the divide between academic and non-academic careers, with considerable time spent at the hiring table in both capacities. I've also maintained a separate entrepreneurial career where I publish, consult for universities and other organizations, and run a one-on-one coaching business. I have a deep interest, a passion even, for sharing the wisdom I've acquired over the years, and I'm committed to saving PhD students and emerging professionals from reinventing all of the wheels so they can use that energy instead to go out and change the world, or to enjoy their lives and their time outside of work a little bit more. My book, The Unruly PhD, Doubts, Detours, Departures, and Other Success Stories, was one of the earliest avenues I used to share that passion. And in keeping with my theme, it's about the power of storytelling and first-person perspectives to create a sense of belonging and inspire new possibilities. Here are some difficult truths about academia today. Most people who graduate with a PhD in the humanities will not build a career on the tenure track. This has been the case for many years and is well known in academia. However, the training offered by graduate programs continues to focus on the skill sets and experiences necessary within the professorate. Meanwhile, the storytelling that takes place in academic contexts tends to suggest that academic positions are the most worthwhile, disregarding or diminishing the importance of other kinds of work. Psychologically, this creates an unnecessary burden for students who must live with this disconnect between what's being said and taught and a looming reality that is likely quite different, year in and year out, over the course of a PhD degree. On a practical level, it leaves students wondering how and when they will develop the skills necessary to apply for the jobs they are more likely to obtain, those that are off the tenure track. This panel aims to offer an optimistic, solution-oriented, and inspiring intervention into this dynamic in the form of a robust and clear-eyed conversation on the state of academic professionalization and professional self-fashioning today. In particular, we'll talk about three distinct yet interrelated areas. First, professionalization. How are graduate departments across the country approaching professionalization training, and how are programs supporting students in building the skills they need to enter job markets as competitive candidates? Second, AltAc careers. Where are humanities graduate students building meaningful careers that do not rely on the tenure track? How are they finding these jobs? And how are they gathering the information, training, and support that they need? And finally, entrepreneurship. What kinds of innovations are being made by academic entrepreneurs? How are people with academic training in the humanities uniquely poised to become entrepreneurs or to support students with entrepreneurial goals? Let's join our panelists now and get into it. My name is Rebecca Peabody. I'm the chair of today's panel, and it is truly a pleasure to be here with you talking about one of my favorite subjects, which is reimagining the present and future potential of the humanities PhD, especially when it's used beyond academia. And it's an honor to be joined by four truly distinguished scholars who are all making interventions, leading revolutions, and guiding students into that future. And with that, let's begin the introductions.
All right. Well, thank you all very much for coming. My name is Clint Fluker, and I'm coming from Atlanta, Georgia. And I like to start with my family. So I have a 9-year-old son named Zane. I have a 4-year-old daughter named Nilu, and I've been married to my wife now almost 14 years, Naseem, and she'll come up more in this talk, because a lot of the stuff that we do it together. I'm also an artist, a filmmaker, and a writer when time permits. But during the workday, I'm the Senior Director for Culture, Community, and Partner Engagement for Emory University Libraries, the Michael C. Carlos Museum, and the Emory Center for Digital Scholarship. In this capacity, I'm responsible for developing initiatives that connect Emory's collecting institutions to the cultural and civic ecosystems of Atlanta. This is largely a public scholarship role meant to provide a cohesive strategy across these 7 distinct units to accomplish 3 main goals. Highlight the work of the archivists, the curators, the librarians, the digital scholars, and the museum professionals. Create lasting partnerships in our community with individuals and organizations, and develop institutional initiatives meant to endure. So we try and stay away from one-offs. And this work takes many forms, including exhibitions, symposiums, documentaries, artist residencies, lecture series, digital scholarship projects, scholarly articles, books, podcasts, internships, all the dope stuff. And I really came to this work largely as a scholar and a curator of Black archival collections. And I got my MA and PhD from the American Studies program at the Institute for Liberal Arts at Emory University.
My name is Dr. Jessica Samuel. I am an interdisciplinary scholar, an educator, a decolonial activist, and an entrepreneur. My research sits at the intersections of environmental justice, Black ecologies and geographies, educational equity, and colonialism, focusing on the Caribbean and the United States mainland and the American Caribbean. So I actually currently hold a postdoc appointment at Washington University in St. Louis. I'm in my 2nd year of that appointment and wrapping up. And interestingly enough, on the job market, pursuing full-time my entrepreneurship. So that's an exciting and interesting thing. And I'm happy to talk more about my strategy there and what that means for professional trajectories and career thinking. Yeah, so at WashU, my first book project is actually entitled From Virgin Land to Virgin Islands: How Colonial Myths Haunt Educational Aims on St. John, where I explore the relationship between conservation colonialism on the island and its relationship to educational opportunity and eventually self-determination for the primarily Black African descendants of the island. For those who don't know, St. John is primarily and predominantly occupied by the Virgin Islands National Park, which is 60% of the island's landmass. So in my capacity as entrepreneur, I'm actually the founder and CEO of Radical Education and Advocacy League. This is a decolonial educational organization that works with historically underserved and minoritized students and the people who serve them as well, so 2 populations. And we essentially provide them strategies, tools, and techniques for how to thrive in their various educational journeys and not simply survive. And very practically, this looks like the provision and delivery of workshops, various curriculum and programming, coaching, and a host of other guest speaking engagements that focus on our Radical 360 framework, which is all about the self-discovery process. And so we see radical self-discovery as instrumental and critical to professional and personal development. And finally, I would say that I have a background in K through 12, and that informs a lot of the work that I do. Prior to getting my PhD, prior to forming and founding this company, I was teaching high school English in St. Louis back in the day. So this is my 2nd go around in the city. And that was very transformative and absolutely informs everything that I do, both in my research as well as in my business. So I'm happy to talk about that as well in detail. When I'm not writing, pontificating, facilitating, and speaking, I like to binge watch Abbott Elementary, The Morning Show, and now The Diplomat. So that's a little bit about me.
I'm Teresa Runstedler. I am a full professor in the history department at American University, and I'm also the chair of the critical race, gender, and culture studies department there. But my primary appointment is in history, and that's where I work with both MA and PhD students. I actually started out my career at the University at Buffalo in 2007, so right before the economic collapse. I just sort of got in there and managed to get a tenure track job, which, I saw many of my colleagues who were maybe a year or 2 behind me get really impacted by the 2008 financial crisis. But that's where I started mentoring my first graduate students in American Studies. So I've mentored a lot of grad students across the spectrum of folks who are more more so doing women's studies, folks who are doing African American studies, history, the whole gamut. But where I am now, and I've been there since 2013, in the history program, we have a regular MA program, we have a public history MA program, and a PhD program, which is really tiny. We only let in about 3 students a year because our funding is really terrible. Even though they're unionized, they are not paid a living wage. Many of the MA students that I work with also work full-time. So I teach them in the evenings. And for the PhD students, because the stipends are so low compared to the cost of living in DC, they all have side gigs. And in fact, I have a student who's writing a dissertation while she's a full-time civil servant in the federal government. And I've sort of seen her get fired and then rehired and then furloughed, and then now she's back working again. So that's been super disruptive for her dissertation progress. But I think one of the things that I do working with graduate students who are in this kind of financial precarity is rather than look at what they're doing outside of the classroom as a distraction from their studies, I found that they often are able to parlay those jobs into career opportunities after grad school. So much of my mentorship involves guiding students in conceptualizing and finishing their dissertations while doing other work, both in and outside of the higher ed space. So many do actually, and I encourage them to do local projects because they can develop relationships with institutions and organizations. I have friends and alumni from our program who talk about different career paths. I always invite them into our graduate colloquia to talk about, what does it mean to be a research for hire consultant? What does it mean to be a public history contractor? And they can, even though I don't know how to tell them how to go after those kinds of opportunities, I can put them in contact with people who do know how to do those things. So that's sort of my connection to graduate education and professionalization. I've worked at 2 institutions where folks really have to find ways to make a way out of no way. And again, rather than looking at that as a drawback, trying to turn that into opportunity. And when we talk about AltAc careers, I went through actually and did a whole list of all the students I've worked with. And it's a pretty incredible list of AltAc careers.
I am Heidi Artizone. My scholarship is on mixed race identities, cross interracial marriage. My first 2 books are Love on Trial, An American Scandal in Black and White, about the Rhinelander case. Second one is a biography of Belle DaCosta Green. But I'm here primarily through my administrative work. I'm the chair of American Studies at St. Louis University. I've been the chair and or interim chair for the last 9 years, and also for some of that was also the graduate coordinator until we were able to split that position off. When I came to SLU in 2011, they already had a few things in place to try to help step PhD students and MA students. We have an embedded program into non-academic careers. Primarily, we offer an internship for PhD students. And when I did a program review in 2017, I had a hard time finding other American Studies PhD programs that did that. Undergrads, yes, absolutely. MA programs quite often. But I would say most of our PhD students do that. It's not a requirement, but it does help with the careers. In addition to that, when I arrived, we had certainly 1, maybe 2 weeks in our professionalization course on AltAc job opportunities. We would bring a panel of alum in to talk to them. And that's the universal reality that we lived with at that time. While we did very little, about half of our students, our PhD students, went on to have non-academic or non-teaching focused careers. So some of the things that I tried to do was, when I taught the professionalization course, I added more materials, not only dedicating a few weeks just to that topic, but integrating non-academic job alternatives to all of the kind of material creation that they were doing, creating CVs and job letters and grants and all of that. I also, and this part was actually at the behest of my graduate students and a weekend symposium at WashU that I attended on public humanities and the PhD. They formed something called a Public Humanities Group, and I formed a Public Humanities Institute. And by creating those names, I got funding from the university, to put on a series of panels, speakers, workshops in 2018, 2019, and you see what's coming out with COVID. And although it has not been resurrected as a public humanities initiative, the department does continue to do more programming on our own, which I think is actually possibly better. As a result of both these expansions and elevation of our cred around campus for being a PhD program that already did this when other humanities PhD programs started panicking when they realized that they had to do something. This brought the attention of our dean's office and to some extent the upper administration to our department, which is otherwise a very tiny and under-resourced department within the College of Arts and Sciences. And the one concrete outcome for that is we now have a one-year in partnership with the Missouri History Museum, where we have 3 PhDs and 1 MA and 1 ABD who's still working on their dissertation, have full-time jobs there, one of whom is now the director of the entire museum. And this is a major organization in St. Louis. Everybody knows what the Missouri History Museum is. And that was funded by the dean for our graduate students. And it's essentially an extended and very intensive version of an internship. The goal is for both us and the folks at the museum who work with that student to create the skill sets for the kind of public humanities jobs that they are looking for.
Thank you. I love that we're getting into the success stories already. I also want to just briefly in absentia introduce Alvin Henry from San Diego State University, who you'll see on the program and was meant to be with us today. He was an important part of our planning and development of the panel, but unexpectedly couldn't make it. But we are hoping to bring his voice into the conversation at a future date. So let's dive in with our questions. I want to start by talking about professionalization. And I will frame that by saying I'm mostly interested, as I think we all are, in professionalization as preparation for jobs off the tenure track, but I also want to acknowledge that professionalization training for jobs on the tenure track is also an issue within PhD programs. So diving into professionalization, I'd love to know what your thoughts are about how professionalization opportunities and training are provided or not being provided to PhD students at your institutions. And there's a number of directions from which this could be approached. It could be your personal experience as a graduate student. It could be what you're seeing. It could be what you personally are doing. It could even be what you think we should be doing as institutions and training centers for graduate students in the future.
I actually think there's quite a lot of opportunities for this at Emory University. I will focus on 3 areas. One is fellowships and internships, and the other one is graduate research positions. Then one is artist residencies, which are pretty interesting. Often the opportunities that are available aren't seen as professionalization opportunities. They're just programs that happen, and I like to kind of reorient them. Also, I should note that I'm really interested in not just people who are in their PhDs, but also undergraduates who think they would like to do a PhD, because I think the training needs to start that early. If you go into a PhD program with an entrepreneurial attitude, I think it really helps the process moving through it. So, and also I'm mostly focused on people who are interested in doing curatorial work or working in archives and museums. That's my area of expertise, but it also does extend to people interested in public humanities generally. So first example of fellowships, an undergraduate fellowship and internship, is something that we run out of the Stuart Rose Library, and it's a partnership with the Benny Andrews Foundation and also with the Atlanta University Center Curatorial Studies program. So this is the AUC, as we call it, is where you have the HBCUs in Atlanta, Spelman College, Morehouse College, Clark Atlanta University, and ITC. So this partnership takes one student over the summer, and they work with the Benny Andrews Foundation for 1 month in New York to look at the art of Benny Andrews, who was famous, very important Black artist, particularly throughout the Black arts movement. And his archives are housed at Emory, his papers. And so they spend another month working with the curatorial staff and the archive staff at the archives at Emory. And in that process, they have to do an important thing, which is they have to curate an exhibit at the end of that summer fellowship. And that exhibit is either a physical exhibit or it is a digital exhibit of some kind that will live on the Benny Andrews website. While doing this, though, they have the opportunity to work with and be interviewed and have interviews with the directors of all these various programs, with local artists, with the estate of Benny Andrews, and really anyone else that they would like to meet. I tell them in advance, if you want to meet them, put them on a list and we will figure out how we can get that done. Our most successful version of this, I think, really happened in 2023 when we started the program, where we had the opportunity to have Nadia Scott, who was a senior at Spelman, curate her own exhibit at the Carlos Museum. And it lasted for 3 months. And of course, some of our own curators were jealous. But through that training, she was incredible. And now she has gone off to being a PhD in art history, but really does have this profound interest in being a curator. So having already curated, then going into your PhD is really important for her trajectory. The graduate research programs that we have, where you just like your GRA, often people just, kind of go to the library and they sit at the desk and they just sort of pass the paper out or whatever it is, log people coming in and out. That is definitely something that people should do, but you can also do more with it. And one way in which we wanted to highlight that was last year, 2 years ago we did this, but then we started screening it this year. We did a documentary with the Academic Technology Studio, which is one of our units. And this documentary was really about Valerie Boyd, who is a very important editor and writer, biographer of Zora Neale Hurston, and edited the letters or the journals of Alice Walker before she passed away recently. What is important about that documentary and not just talking about her life and her papers that are housed at Emory, was really the interviews that we did to talk about her life and her research. We wanted to talk about specifically how graduate research assistants could use the archives to either be an archivist or to publish a book or to be a journalist like Valerie Boyd was. How did those people come to the archives? What's the process they go through? And we interviewed one of the graduate students that worked with Valerie Boyd throughout the entire process of her editing Alice Walker's journals for the book that was published, Gathering Blossoms. And her name was Nicole Morris Johnson. And she talked about what it was like to work with Alice Walker, what it was like to be in the editing process with Valerie Boyd. And so as we screen that documentary, it's actually targeted at students. It's a way to engage them, let them see how this kind of thing can actually work. Last but not least, artist residencies. I do a lot of exhibits, organize the exhibits, curate the exhibits. But what's most fun is when we get to partner with local artists. So very recently for the World Cup initiative that we have at Emory, we're calling it Footwork. We're having 3 exhibits that are at 3 different institutions across Emory. And they're all featuring archival collections about the history of Atlanta soccer that come from the archives. What's really fun about this, though, is we also have a local artist named Charlie Palmer, who's teaching a class of students on how to actually get a commission and do a commission project. So he's been tasked with creating an image, a mural, based off of these archives. But rather than just have him go to the archives himself, we have him teaching a full class, going with the students, showing them what it means to do research as an artist, but then to have a product at the end that you're selling. And when he's done with it, after they've helped him with the mural and gone through all this process, they will then in the spring, he'll be teaching just that, artists and entrepreneurship. He'll have several lectures throughout the year to help people understand what they did and how he does it as a professional. So these are the types of things that we try and generate through my unit. And while they're seen sometimes as just programs, or maybe they're not seen as specifically for professionalization, that's always on our mind, is if we catch them as undergraduates and as graduate students, then maybe they'll have a better shot when they leave because they're already doing the work as opposed to thinking about doing the work.
That's so incredible. Yeah. Thank you for sharing. Got so many great ideas for my institutions and how we should be thinking about all of that too. So I'm going to share 3 examples of opportunities around professionalization that I've either directly engaged or know of between my PhD journey and now. So first, I got my PhD in American Studies at Boston University. So American Studies in the house, literally. And one of the things that really framed my journey as a graduate student a few years ago was this real deep commitment to being place-based in my work and really thinking actively and critically about where I was and how I could further and very deeply and intentionally engage where I was. So yes, I was getting schooling in Boston at BU, but that should not and could not be the extent and breadth and depth of my engagement with that city. And so one of the things that I did was really turn to my network and think about all of the other connections I had. So namely, as a Mellon Mays undergraduate fellow, I thought about my connection connections through MMUF and the number of people in the surrounding Massachusetts area who belonged to that network and the kind of work that they were doing. I was also a Teach for America core member, so I was thinking very carefully about TFA, the network in Boston, the kind of grassroots education organizing work that they were doing, and looking to be plugged in. So very early on, I joined so many education groups and organizing committees and ended up in Colorado doing policy and advocacy training with a whole bunch of educators from across the United States while being a graduate student, right? And so I saw myself constantly being exposed to professionalization opportunities that were outside of the very concrete and discrete realms of being an academic within the ivory tower. I was also thinking about my undergraduate network and thinking about the people who I went to school with and connecting to them, even my study abroad network, people who I had lived in Bahia with and I knew were from the area or still living in the area, and just having like relational meetings. So I'm getting into like the mechanics of how you do this, right? And this is really intentional because I think when we say like be, play, space, sometimes it can be so abstracted that people don't really know like what are the literal things that you do to make sure that you're grounding yourself. So just literally reaching out to folks who I knew and belonged to some network that I belonged to and asking them what they were up to, and organically finding myself in all of these opportunities. And all of that actually ended up in one way or another to me getting policy fellowship through Leadership for Educational Equity, which is an alumna organization for specifically TFA core members, right? But I had not known that they were working so actively in the area until I reached out to TFA. And I ended up serving for the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education for a summer internship or fellowship, which eventually turned into an appointment by the Commissioner of Education on the board for the Racial Imbalance Advisory Council. And I served on that board for over 6 years. And that was one of the most incredible opportunities of my life. And my appointment happened while I was yet in graduate school. So really thinking about how all of these, like the cartography of my network and my connections led to a literal position as a summer gig and then an even more substantial civic appointment. The second thing I want to mention is what BU specifically was doing by way of professionalization. So we have the Bush Center at BU, which is a BU Center for Humanities. And they are quite renowned in that the scholarship that comes out of the center is really phenomenal, but also they have been thinking very expansively and imaginatively about how to professionalize graduate students. And so one of their biggest programs is actually an internship program where various graduate students from across arts and sciences can apply to basically be paired with an internship opportunity in the city of Boston. So folks are paired with the mayor's office, with the Boston Athenaeum, with the Contemporary Art Museum, with the Massachusetts Historical Society. Literally, there were just like all these various posts. And it was competitive, right? Because there's probably like 1 to 2 positions per placement. But it was such an incredible opportunity for graduate students to effectively put into application their research and analysis skills and also develop other skill set. And I know that that's something that has received such high praise and folks continue to enjoy. And I believe the program is still running and has proven to be a pathway for folks to actually gain employment after graduation because they've already developed those connections and have been previously employed. Now, the third example comes from my own work. So through REAL, we have what is called the Liberatory Career Design Program. And this is a program that's geared towards graduate students to really think very critically and actively about who they want to be at the end of the journey. And so we work with you through this 6 to 8 week program, through various modules and coaching to think about where are you currently, what are your ambitions, what are your motivations, what are your values, and where do you want to end up, and why do you want to end up there, and what are the possibilities. And so it's really just about going through the process of thinking really expansively, imaginatively, creatively, intentionally about your career in a way that can liberate you from the confines of the status quo. Right? And like, what are the expectations of you because you have a PhD, which oftentimes is just to do the tenure track thing. It doesn't have to be that way. So the other thing I wanted to raise, and I just added this as we were thinking and talking, was that professionalization can come through other sort of quotidian, mundane means. I'm thinking about like graduate student organizations, right? So while I was at BU, I served as vice president for the graduate student organization, and that was across the arts and sciences. And that was a huge student body to basically be in leadership, but it provided so much opportunity for professional development because you're literally in a leadership post. And I was treasurer. I don't know how I did both of those things. Mind you, finance is not my sweet spot in any way. I'm not a math girly at all, but I handle people's money really well. And I think I can be a treasurer again sometime for somebody else. But I do think it's really cool to think about how the things that you automatically will put on your CV, right? Like even right now, I am conference chair for the Black Women's Studies Association. And a lot of our e-board is actually made up of graduate students. And I was thinking very creative. I was like, this is like really amazing because these are graduate students who are really like responsible for executing the mandates of a very, like it's a legitimate academic association. We are younger, but we're doing a lot of big work. And one of the big projects we have coming up is actually creating and curating our own press through our association. And I'm just thinking about like into the future, the kind of exposure that our membership and body will have to that sort of professional development because of the work that we're doing and because of their appointment on our board. So I think thinking about all those things can be really helpful. And I really do think it is incumbent upon grad programs to also think about place and how they may help to bridge the gap between local opportunities and what they provide in school.
You actually just made me think of something because Rebecca and I went to the same graduate school together, and a lot of our colleagues were very involved in the graduate student union. Many of them actually went on to become legit high-level union organizers. So they graduated, got their PhDs, and went and used the skills that they learned, right, and the knowledge, the frameworks, et cetera, then to go and work with unions both in the United States and Canada. I'll be quick here because my university as a whole does not really have anything formal to foster professionalization of grad students, unfortunately. Everything happens informally. Really up until this year, with the Trump administration, PhD students often were able to find work in DC as government contractors. So I had a couple of point people that I could direct folks to so that they would know how to, sign up into and make themselves available to be government contractors. Some working, we have lots of links with the Smithsonian and other public humanities institutions, public historical sites in DC, but it'll be interesting to see how this pans out now with the sort of deconstruction of the state that's going on right now. We do have a public history MA program. They have built into their curriculum a practicum. I think they have to take a couple of these, and they work with a faculty member and then also somebody at a DC institution, often the Smithsonian, and they actually put together research that will inform an exhibit. We used to have an institutional membership to the NCFDD, if anyone knows what that is, a National Center for Faculty Development and Diversity. I might have that the wrong way around, but it was canceled. I'm experiencing all sorts of budget cuts at my institution. And so we're entering a whole new level of cuts. And so that was actually the first thing to go. One particularly notable project at American University is the Humanities truck. I can't claim any credit for this. This is the brainchild of my colleague, Dan Kerr, and you can Google it. It's humanitiestruck.com, and it's literally a truck. It's like a food truck, except for the humanities. And students can actually, get fellowships to work with this humanities truck, and they, learn how to drive it. And they go to wherever it is in DC to do oral histories and other modes of partnering with local communities to tell their stories. So it's an amazing project. So I encourage folks to take a look at that. The only other thing that I will say is that I actually, before I went to grad school, I was a professional dancer. So I worked in the gig economy in the late 90s. And I also worked in sports media, public relations. So I had already this experience of what it's like to work in many different environments, and then also how to piece together, the pennies to pay your rent. And so I try as much as possible to use some of that experience to also inform how I mentor students and strategies that they can use to stay organized and, put themselves out there, and also to recognize the skills that they actually are learning through doing things that you wouldn't think are professionalization.
We, like most universities, have a career centers, and like most universities, they ignored grad students. So we've been working with the career centers, forcing them to come to our grad students and provide non-academic career resources for them. Funding for summer internships has been another one. The opportunity is there. For grad students, we would cover the tuition credit so that it could count towards the degree, but that takes them out of at least a part-time job. So now we're offering $3,500 for doing the internship just as a grant. Offering classes in the public humanities, and in our case, St. Louis, the local community. The public humanities courses have been difficult to staff. We used to do the kind of old-fashioned good use of the adjunct position and bring in a professional, one of our PhDs, to teach that. That person is now the director, so we can't ask him to do it anymore. He takes on too much. And then the final thing is an aspirational one. Our university is going through a strategic planning, which is very much a ho-hum yawn thing, except one of their categories is community engagement. So we are trying to throw data at them, not just I'm always trying to promote the American Studies department, of course, but also for ideas for them. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. I want to mention in this context that the Getty, where I work, also runs an internship program called the Getty Graduate Internship, which is a fully funded year-long placement in one of the many different departments across the Getty. So that could include the curatorial department, but it also includes public programs, multiple positions in the library, web and new media, publishing, communications development. So those are announced every fall, and they provide a really unique opportunity for graduate students from anywhere in the world to come and have a year-long job placement developing skill sets as they're completing their graduate studies. I'll turn now to our second question. The time is flying by, and this is such great information, but we'll have to keep our answers to this one to maybe 2 minutes each so we have time for everything. AltAc careers. Quick disclaimer, it's a problematic term because it is baked into it is the assumption that everything that is not an academic career is an alternative to it, when I think more and more people are coming to graduate school knowing that they will not work in academia. But it is a term that has legibility. So I'd love to hear about your experiences with PhDs heading into AltAc. We know the statistics, but I'd love to know what you've seen. I'd love to know what you're seeing about those searches, where students are landing, how they're finding and developing the skills they need to be in those positions, and what you're hearing back from them.
So for me, I don't teach anymore. When I was teaching at Clark Atlanta University, a lot of the students I worked with also wanted to be curators, or they wanted to work in archives in some way, probably because of the nature of the classes we were teaching. But I found that certainly that's the case at Emory. A lot of the conversations I have, whether if someone shoots an email to me or wants to, engage in, some mentorship, it's usually to figure out how to translate that PhD that they're into a curatorial practice of some kind. So I'll, again, stick to that area. In some cases, though, I'd say they're interested in doing work that's not unlike mine, which is related to that, because, again, that's where I came from, but it's kind of more of an in-between space. So splitting up with undergrads and grads. With undergrads, I've encouraged those that are inclined to get into a fully funded PhD program to go ahead and do that. But I do really emphasize fully funded MA PhD program if you can do that, because that's going to be very important down the line. And they should do this with the curatorial trajectory in mind upon entry. It just really helps organize what they're doing. They can talk to the head of their dissertation or their advisors along the way. I was like, I stay out of that, but keep this in your mind while you're doing this. For the grads, lately, I've been taking meetings with grad students who are often like ABD and realizing kind of what they've gotten themselves into. And I told them a few things. One is to, first and foremost, find a mentor, someone who already does what you actually want to do. and you need to be in conversation with them, and that needs to be bi-directional. So they're giving you information, but what can you provide to them as well? Just because you're a student does not mean that you don't have a skill set and that you can't help each other. Stop asking for permission. No one gives you the title of curator, writer, and artist. You have to do that for yourself. And I think a lot of times when you're in that dissertating phase, you're constantly asking for permission from an advisor to say that you're okay. In the more entrepreneurial side of things, the more professional side of things, you cannot act like that. Like, you have to assume more space. Start immediately. So if you are a first year, that's even better than if you're a second year, third year, fourth year. Start immediately. And if you wanted to be a curator or you want to be a writer, put that package together, like right then. If you just using curating as an example, what do you want to curate? Is there something that doesn't require $100,000 for you to do that you could immediately get going, and all you really need is to talk to someone about it to give you space? That's what you need to do. And then last but not least is introduce yourself to whoever is in charge at all times. Again, I think a lot of times either as undergrads or first years, people are afraid to talk to the director or to the dean or to the provost or the vice provost. I've found through experience, but also as I work with students, that it's amazing how people love to talk about themselves. So if you ask first to have a meeting, ask them about themselves and how they got there, and then talk about what you're doing, and then pitch those things that you put together already directly to people like them and to people like me. Because often I want the ideas that people are coming up with, and I just want to see them through. If I'm coming up with all the ideas, then we're really not doing this correctly. So if it's coming from a grad student who already has a great concept, even better.
Yeah, I will say a few things. One is that I am such a proponent of gap years. I really do think it's important and this assumes that you have not begun a program. Like, if you're coming from undergrad, I really do think it's a beautiful thing to step aside and go do something that is of interest to you and develop different types of skill sets. And this might be, contrary to whomever. I know that it's something that has proven deeply fruitful and generative for me and the people who are in my community. Stepping out of undergrad, slated to go get my PhD because I was an MMUF fellow, right? But yet pivoting to teach K through 12 is really what ended up informing the breadth and depth of my scholarship today. If I had not been in St. Louis, Missouri, teaching high school English to students on the north side of the city in the middle of the Ferguson uprising, I would not have the kind of intervention that I have, and I would not be positioning myself the way that I do. And so I think that there is something really powerful about stepping outside of the ivory tower. I hate having to say it all the time, but just step outside of it. Go do something else and test yourself and grow yourself and learn yourself and explore all that you could possibly be. Because when you come back, it situates you differently. It just does. It situates you differently in relationship to your peers, in relationship to the research, to the very project of getting a PhD, and you understand your contributions from a very grounded and solid place where you are more self-possessed, which is what I think Clint is also speaking to, right? And graduate programs are really good at making you feel like imposters. So I say go do your own thing and then come back in. I would also say work with who you would want to work with. And this goes back to what I said earlier around taking those opportunities and flipping them, right? And making them work for you in the long term. Do the internships, do the summer things, do the little gigs, and then talk to the people and see how you can sustain those relationships. I literally could have had a full-time job working in the Department of Ed if I wanted to while I was still doing my PhD. But I didn't want to do that. I was like, this is a lot. I'm just trying to do this thing. But that's literally what that produced for me right away, because I went in, I did great work. People saw me, they wanted to keep me. And I was like, I can't, this is literally impossible. But doing that, I think, really can open doors. And then finally, I wanted to say that at WashU, we have something called Handshake. Are people familiar with that? Right? Okay, cool. This is my first time engaging with that platform as a postdoc. And there are always opportunities on there to think about alternative careers outside of tenure track roles or lectureships or any type of academic road honestly. And the one specific thing that pops up over and over again, as problematic as it is AI. And there are all these AI fellowships. where they're hiring PhD holders or soon to be to come and help them create models. Now, you may feel all kinds of ways about that, but it is an opportunity and it is one way to think about the alternatives to academia.
I will also second the idea of a gap year. I did 3 years after undergrad, and I initially had thought, oh God, this is like, my parents are like, what are you doing with your life? You know, it was like freelance dancer. But when I went back to grad school, I was like, this is easy. Like, you're going to pay me a stipend? I get to sit and read? Oh, this is easy. Anyhow, AltAc careers. I've actually had, over the years, more students who have gone into quote-unquote AltAc careers than the traditional academic route. Only 4 that I can think of have tenure track jobs, and only 2 are at an R2. So let me just quickly say what some of the career paths that they've gone. I have a student who went back to Denmark. He's now a diversity consultant for companies and institutions there, taking his American Studies frameworks, intersectionality, and all of those things, and trying to apply them in the corporate space. I have a grad who now teaches at a very elite private school in DC, probably makes more money than, a VAP. He also runs his own Substack with thousands of followers because he's a basketball history buff. And he had started that as a grad school, and he's got a lot of subscribers. Many actually who went into community college teaching. Some who made the jump to a teaching university, others who stayed in the community college space, people who went into ed tech, helping with learning management systems. They need people who are, have taught before to actually work at those companies. Somebody who is working for an academic professional association. Somebody who's a public history contractor, directing an oral history project. One of them created a podcast for DC Humanities based on their dissertation research. I have students who made the transition to student services in higher ed. They often started working at the university before graduating and then subsequently parlayed that into higher paying jobs at other universities. Somebody who works for the New York State Division of Historic Preservation. Somebody who works in study abroad programs. Somebody who works for Fulbright in Poland. I have other students who have turned to trade press book writing. And my current student is working for the National Historical Publications and Records Commission as a director of community programs. So you can see it's all across the board, but often they started developing the skills in order to do these things while they were doing their dissertations.
So on that last note, the merging of the work on the dissertation and the development of another career track, we have students come to us already in full-time jobs that they don't want to leave. And so they become part-time students, which means they're not eligible for stipends, just credits. And that's because the university, and this is a national thing, not a SLU-specific thing. If you have a 20 hours or work on your GA-ship, and 20 hours, I believe, is standard, you can't have another job. And if you do, you're jeopardizing that job. So one piece of advice is don't tell us. No, I'm serious. I don't want to know. I need plausible deniability. Only happened once, but I have seen a student lose a GA-ship because the dean of graduate studies saw them on TV talking about their business. Yes, oh shit, indeed. And so now I don't get to learn about all the interesting things my students are doing. If I were just a professor, it might be different. But obviously you can still do it. But it means we can't help you, right? Of course, some students also take jobs doing things that aren't so public. Entrepreneurship, I think, requires a public face for whatever you're doing. You have to advertise yourself somewhere. And that's where it becomes problematic. But, the students also drive Ubers and do stock work for Target and so forth. But I've had students come in as part-time students. They get funding in the sense that we can give them tuition credit scholarships. They usually take 1 or 2 courses per semester, so it's a longer time to degree. That's also a problem because the university doesn't actually recognize part-time PhD students and puts them on the same time to degree as full-time students. So we have to work. That I can work. It involves like strategic leaves of absence after they're done with classes and things like that to stop the clock. And we can continue to work with them on dissertations or even lit review lists. So those students are teaching secondary schools, teaching in communities or local colleges where they don't actually need a PhD, obviously, to get the job. But often the also don't need it for promotion. They're looking for administrative work, which does require a PhD. At many non-SLAC or R1 higher education schools, they're in the national parks. They've had that up and down in the National Archives. The one successful example that I could think of a student who's come in full-time with a number of side gigs, we've been able to, he's a filmmaker, and we've been able to parlay the one most public one, which just was screened on campus, and he was on the panel as the filmmaker. But it was about Mill Creek Valley, which is a formerly Black neighborhood that SLU now occupies the space of. And so that is connected to our mission as a department to think about our history and his specific interest in African American experiences and cultures.
Thank you. And thank you for the transition to our third and final topic, Heidi. Entrepreneurship, which is a subject making my work easy, a subject that's near and dear to my heart. Again, probably a 2-minute answer from everyone, but please tell us how entrepreneurship intersects with your work, either because you are yourself an entrepreneur and or to the students you work with. And thank you, Clint, for introducing the idea of the metaphorical potential of entrepreneurship early in our conversation as well. I think having an entrepreneurial mindset while working within an organization is also a very powerful way to think about this topic.
All right, thank you. So I will talk about myself, and I'll say that I feel like my entire career has felt entrepreneurial from the jump. I think some of this is because I received an interdisciplinary PhD. It was called the Institute for Liberal Arts at Emory. It's no longer there, but my scholarship focused on contemporary movements in Black speculative fiction and literature and film. And so stuff like Afrofuturism, the Ethno-Gothic, Sword and Soul, but explaining how that knowledge is valuable to an institution is easier said than done. It's very cool, though. So my wife, who I talked about earlier, she helped me out. And in our first year of marriage and my first year of being in the program, she said, stop watching movies all day and go get a job. And I was like, okay, so I got 2. And I worked as the editor for one of the digital journals at the Center for Digital Scholarship, which was very helpful to my trajectory, and as the assistant curator for African American special collections at the Stuart Rose Library. And so while doing those jobs, I realized my vocation, which was to build community around Black archival collections. But also, this is when my wife and I started an art salon series outside of the university that has become the cornerstone of my professional life. So in 2014, I was given the opportunity as a graduate student working in the archives to curate my first exhibition while still in grad school. So it was a collection of the artist, professor, filmmaker Camille Billups and her prints that were housed at Rose Library. And while doing the research, I came across one of her quotes, which was, "Nobody's coming for us but us." And this became the title of the exhibit, but also became a mantra for my life. And I wanted to be a curator, but nobody was coming for me. So I had to gather my own supporters. And inspired by Camille Billups, Nassim and I started a monthly art salon featuring local artists. And we did interviews with Atlanta's cultural leaders. And we called it Lift Art Salon. And we thought it would be like 20 people to start out. It was more like 200. And it was like each time. And we did it at historic buildings. This is before we had kids, y'all. We did it at historic buildings, homes across the city. And this salon provided me with the opportunity to curate once a month. So I had a huge resume of curatorial work and interact with dynamic people who I would otherwise have no reason to speak to. But it also enabled me to create genuine relationships with people who would be future donors to archives, co-authors on articles, collaborators on documentaries, art exhibits, and symposiums. So in short, I kept my hand on the pulse of the city through these salons. And each gathering was like a large focus group, providing me with insight into what works and what doesn't work when creating partnerships and developing public scholarship. So 10 years later, I'm no longer part of the administrative work of what we call that salon. It has evolved into a business that my wife runs full time, and it's called the 10th Social Club. But doing the salon for 10 years has quite literally helped me develop a methodology for how to do public scholarship, and has led to every job I've had to this day, including this one.
Yeah, so I will just say, I'll talk about myself as well in my company, but I'll speak about how I got here more specifically. So the first time I would say I actually enacted entrepreneurship was when I was a K through 12 educator and had been invited to co-author a curriculum for SLPS, the St. Louis Public Schools. And that curriculum was community centered and reflective, really thinking about St. Louis youth and their relationship to local law enforcement and how to repair that, like obviously in the wake of everything that was going on. And it was a really powerful and important developing experience that I had under my belt and kind of like did as a thing that I had done. And then when I got to grad school, I had another opportunity to create another curriculum because I had remembered that I'd done it before by like accident, right? And then I recognized that I can create curriculum. And so I started thinking about that more intentionally, like more actively. And once I was, making good money, better than the money I was making as a graduate student, creating curriculum for various organizations in the city of Boston, I started thinking about what that might mean for the research I was doing and how everything could actually dovetail. So I was already studying education. I had already been a practitioner in like a real pedagogical sense, not how you like fall into teaching because you're a professor and no one ever trains you to teach, right? We don't talk about that enough. Like people aren't actually trained as teachers. You're just presumed to be able to teach because you have this very reputable degree. So I was really putting all the pieces together. I had this experience. I had been a practitioner, an educator, and I was now a scholar. Really like threading the needle was the work, and threading the needle birthed this company. So by the time I graduated in 21, I bet on myself. I said, okay, Jessica, we're going to market. If you do not succeed this time around, I applied to like 2 places, got a campus visit virtually. It was COVID, and that just like didn't work out. I was like, you're going to start your own thing. Like that's your promise to yourself if you don't get this. And so I had to just like start my own thing and fulfill my promise to myself. And I will say this about entrepreneurship. There are ways to do this that can allow you flexibility and not like the steep stress of running your own business. And I highly recommend people starting out with consulting. Like that is one of the easiest sort of like entry points into building out your own thing. Because if you're doing entrepreneurship like for real, it is a full-time, comprehensive, very exhausting, very consuming effort if you're doing it for real. If you want to do it well, like marketing, advertising, like professional development, going to business conferences and learning how to sell. Like that has been the hardest thing, like learning how to sell when you are taught very implicitly to be like humble about your expertise and your skill set. And that's what academia does, right? Like, so how do you translate that and untrain and unlearn? So entrepreneurship is amazing. It can yield a lot of dope things. And one of the biggest things I think it's done for me is helped me to think about like, how can I get the same thing accomplished via different means? How can I touch students' lives? How can I help my colleagues be better at their jobs, but like differently? And I think that goes back to the entrepreneurial mindset.
I don't really have that much to add, but I will say, I'm not going to talk about my own experience, but I do have a colleague who actually left a tenure track job because it was literally ruining his health and was not paying enough money. And while he was about to exit, he basically went around and did informational interviews with all of the people who careers looked interesting to him. But his business sort of snowballed through consulting. He's research for hire, and he makes more money than a typical tenure track professor, spends more time in the archives, spends more time reading. Like, I feel like the further on I've gone in this career, almost the dumber that I've gotten. Because like, I'm just thinking about course scheduling now, So there are ways that you can have a job that actually you're taking the core skill set that you have. And all of it really worked off of word of mouth. And he developed really great relationships with all of the archivists in the area. So he's now the go-to person for that.
I just have 2 things to say. One is just a response to something you heard. We do teacher training very intensively, and we also prepare our students. I don't think any of our graduates in the last 10 years have gone to an R1. Many of them have gotten tenure track positions at perfectly good schools, but it's a different kind of teaching. So we train them for that as well. And then the other thing, and I realize that coming from me is coming from a place of privilege, but I really do believe this. Don't try to monetize everything that you do. keep something for yourself. Okay, they're nodding. So that was okay to say, and I'm going to end there.
Heidi, you have again anticipated my next question. Last one, and this is an optional one. Forces the ingenuity. I love it. If you could sum up one piece of advice in one sentence for current graduate students, something that you didn't know when you were a graduate student and have learned through this process, what would it be? And I'll go first. I remember when I was earning a PhD, it felt like an all-consuming process and like it was an all-consuming identity once I had it. And I only realized over time that it could actually be the launch pad to a much broader portfolio career with a lot of space for creativity.
Well, I feel like I already said what I think was the most important thing, which was really to start now and to not ask for permission around it. Again, I think that a lot of the work that goes into being a graduate student, which is important work, is, the research and the collaboration with your team of folk that is going to get you through. But in that process, often there is a permission-based conversation. And I just really think when you're doing more entrepreneurial work, you really do need to go at it. And it's just a matter of time and doing it long enough so that you can learn what works and what doesn't. And so the sooner you start that, the better chances you have doing the work that you really want to do. So start as soon as you can, fail, but start it so that you can learn from those experiences.
Yeah, I think my one sentence, hopefully it's a sentence, it's a thought coming out right now, is to, I don't know how I'm going to put this, because they're like two strains. So one is to imagine what it would look like if you got everything you wanted. Like, what would it look like if you lived the life that you wanted to live? Actually take time to imagine that. I think it's easy to just kind of like go with the flow and fall in step with the status quo. But take a moment to actually think, like, imagine, literally create a picture in your head. If it all worked out, what would it look like? I think my last tip is to think bigger than where you are. Think bigger than where you are.
Oh gosh, I don't know if I have a one sentence. I always tell my grad students, just get out of your own way. I think, just do it, and that applies to dissertation writing, it applies to so many things. And you might just have to do it incrementally. And it's okay to just do a little bit and then do a little bit more and then do a little bit more. And something will come of it.
So I got nothing in grad school. So I would have wanted all of this. But also, as somebody who did end up as a Research 1 tenure track professor or tenured professor, associate professor, give me 2 more years. Learn about all of these alternatives anyway, because if you don't take them yourself, first of all, imagining different outcomes is inherently useful, even if you don't take them yourself. And then also, if you're a Research 1 tenure track professor, your students will need you to know this, and it will help them. Also, self-care, self-care, self-care.
Thank you very much. I think we can bring this part of the conversation to a close now. Thank you for being part of this conversation. If you found it helpful, please consider leaving a review. And to stay in touch, you can find me at Rebecca Peabody on LinkedIn and Instagram, or RebeccaPeabody.com on the web, where you'll find more information about coaching, community building, my newsletter, and my course on academic off-ramps and entrepreneurship. Let's stay in touch, and I'll see you next time.